Welcome to Chapter 3, Supply and Demand. In Chapter 3, we're going to talk about the supply and demand curves and all the things that go into making those what they are. And when most people think of economics, they think of supply and demand, or at least that's something that is often associated with economics, specifically microeconomics. However, on the macro side, we still need to cover it because when looking at the economy as a whole, supply and demand on a macro scale is still very important. First thing we're talking about are the market participants. All participants, as the slide says, for the most part are trying to obtain the maximum return from the scarce resources they have. Everybody's trying to get the most of what they have. Consumers are trying to get the most that they can from your available income. For the most part, people will live to their means. As a society in the United States, we don't have the skill as a society. Individuals do, but for the most part, we don't save 80% of what we make and then live on the 20% remaining. We tend to live to the right up to our means and maybe save a little bit. But we spend a lot, and because we have a lot of wants, and why we have those is something we'll get to at another time. Businesses want to maximize their profits. They don't want to make some of the profit that they possibly could, or if we think if we do everything right, we can make 100 million a year, but we're just going to relax and only make 10 million this year. That's not how business works. So they want to maximize their profit, and government wants to maximize the general welfare of society. At least that's the goal. Many people have very strong opinions on government and government's role in the society, and oftentimes it seems like government is just trying to get more power for the government. But in an ideal world, the government wants to maximize the general welfare for society in order to strengthen its own position as government. These motives should explain market activity. Everybody wanting to maximize their utility, businesses wanting to maximize profit, and government wanting to maximize welfare. Specialization in trade. We can't make, at least most of us, can't make everything we need. We can't fix our cars, grow our own food, and not even fix our cars, manufacture our own cars. Get out the soldering iron and build our own iPhones. We can't do all that. We have to rely on other people to do what they do well, and we'll purchase what they do well, and then we will have something that we do well, and other people will purchase that through us, either as goods or as services. And that's typically what your job is. And that is that's another primary element of our economy. In the old days, and by old days I mean prior to the Civil War, you were pretty much responsible, especially if you were out of a major city, for everything having to do with your life. You may build your own plow, and then plow your ground and build your own house and grow your own food, and all your time would be spent growing food to survive, and maybe sell a little bit of food to pay for materials to build your home. And it was just this real subsistence level of existence. And at this point in time, we've moved past that, where you only have to do one thing well and you can purchase everything else you need in life. The circular flow. This is a core component of economic theory. There are 2 markets and 4 participants in the circular flow. Consumers, as consumers, own the factors of production, labor. We supply them to firms in business that are in business, and at that point we earn income, and that's how we contribute to the circular flow as consumers. We also purchase goods and services in the product market, so we own production and we purchase. Business firms produce goods and services for the public, so McDonald's produces food using the factors of production they bought from their owners in the factor market. Don't worry about factor market too much. That's a bit of a confusing term. Just think of market. So McDonald's purchases the raw materials from farmers, who are also consumers. They turn that into a sellable good and then sell it back to the to consumers as well. So it's a back and forth situation. Governments, they acquire resources in the market and provide services to both consumers and firms. The government is a tremendous purchaser of both goods and services. And so that's something always to remember. In this country, I believe it's near 40% of all goods and services are purchased by the government. International participants, they supply imports, they supply us with goods, and they also purchase things to export from this country. Locating markets. A market exists wherever an exchange, a transaction takes place. Anytime one thing is traded for another, either whether it's monetary, barter, whatever it may be. If you're giving money for something, or you're trading somebody baseball cards when you were a kid, that's a market. Every market transaction involves an exchange of dollars for goods and services or resources. In the circular flow, we do need to mention this. Goods and services or resources flow one way and dollars flow the other. That's a really fancy way of saying something simple. And what the circular flow really is, to keep it from being too confusing, is that we as consumers provide the labor, we provide capital, we make purchases, and then businesses produce those goods and send them back our way. But even as consumers, we are also working for those businesses. And so the circular flow is just a model that shows how money travels from the individual to the business, and then the business pays that individual a wage, and then that wage is used by the individual to buy goods from yet another business, and that business uses the profits from those goods to pay somebody else's wage. And it just shows that flow of money through the economy. Supply and demand, getting down into the meat of it. Supply is the ability and willingness to sell specific quantities of goods at alternative prices in a given time period, which makes it sound a whole lot more complicated than it really is. And demand, the ability and willingness to buy specific quantities of a good and service at an alternative price in a given time period. And this is important, and I'll explain all this in a second, but this last part is very important. I'm guessing, I don't speak Latin, but I'm guessing this is ceteris paribus. I'm guessing on that. I apologize for those of you that know Latin and know I'm mispronouncing it. This is the assumption that nothing else is changing. Extremely important. When we're going through all of these examples of supply and demand, and in the class in general, many of the concepts we're going to talk about are in a perfect world where there's no outside factors weighing in. Supply and demand works in theory very well. In a practical situation, we're going to show how it's usually true and the model holds, but the outside factors really play with supply and demand and make it extremely complicated. We're dealing with it in its purest, most theoretical form. And what supply basically is the amount of something that's available for purchase, and demand is how many people want to buy something at a given price. And I should say supply is the amount available for purchase at a given price. The demand is how many people want that same product at a given price. Moving on, the law of demand, the quantity demanded of a good at a given time period increases as its price falls. So this is, once again, if all things are being equal. So what this really means is, think of a brand new Mercedes-Benz. How many Mercedes-Benz are demanded if the price point is $1 million per car? Probably very, very, very few. However, if that same Mercedes-Benz was offered for $50 a car, how many people would want to buy one? I'm hoping everybody here, that's a great deal, $50 for a new Mercedes. I hope everyone listening to this wants to buy a Mercedes for $50. The demand would increase exponentially. And so that's basically what the law of demand is. How many people want a specific item at a specific price? And as the price falls, the demand will go up. So there's an inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. As price goes up, the quantity demanded goes down. Every dollar the price for that Mercedes goes up, the demand will fall a little bit. And there's a downward sloping curve on a market diagram. We're going to get to the diagrams in a little bit. Individual demand and market demand. Individual demand is how many Mercedes-Benz at $50 we are in the market for. I might be in the market for 2. Any more than, even at $50, any more than 2, the insurance, and I don't would get to be too much, and no one would drive it. And this is assuming you can't resell, for this example. Assuming you can't resell, and I have nowhere to put them. So I might be in the market for 2, maybe 3. But that would be the extent of my demand. Another example to use for this is maybe a better example would be cheeseburgers. Think of the hungriest you've ever been. What's your demand for a cheeseburger? Probably pretty high. So at $2 for a cheeseburger, let's drop that. 50 cents for a cheeseburger. Well, let's drop it again. 5 cents for a cheeseburger. How many cheeseburgers are you in for at 5 cents? Once again, assuming you can't resell. Well, if you're really hungry, you may buy 2 or 3. And you say, well, it's only 5 cents for a 4th, but if you can't eat it, if you're absolutely full, and for those of you with a big appetite, maybe that number's 6, 7, who knows how many. But once you're full, even at 5 cents for another one, there's no demand. You're full. You can't use another one. So that's the individual demand. Market demand is how many total Mercedes all of us together are in the market for. How many cheeseburgers we're all in the market for together. It's market demand. Factors that set demand behavior. These are the determinants of demand. Tastes, maybe you don't like cheeseburgers. Maybe you're allergic to cheeseburgers. You have no demand at 5 cents. Income, maybe even at $50, dealing with a Mercedes is too much. You don't want to deal with it because you couldn't afford the insurance. Expectations, other goods. Substitutes and complements, this is very important. What's the demand for a Mercedes at, say, a normal price of, say, we'll just pick a round number of $50,000. If BMWs are also $50,000, well, it's going to be pretty stable. Well, but what if BMW drops its price to $25,000? Well, that's a substitute, and everybody who was thinking Mercedes is now saying, well, BMW is a pretty similar car, and it's half the price. I'm going to go buy a BMW, and the demand for Mercedes would go way down. There would not be very much demand because the price of the substitute were to fall. Complements. This would be cereal and milk. If the price of milk goes way high, then the price of cereal, then the demand for cereal is going to drop. Okay, because it's going to be more expensive to have the cereal and milk combination. So I'll say it again. So if the price of milk goes up, the demand for cereal will go down. If the price of hot dog buns goes up, the demand for hot dogs is going to go down. If the price for hot dog buns goes down, the demand for hot dogs is going to go up. So if hot dog buns get real cheap, people are more likely to buy them, and to buy hot dog buns without hot dogs is silly. So you're going to say, well, to get a hot dog and a bun together, they're complements, they go together. Used to be, to put the two together might be 50 cents. Well, now because the price of buns has gone down, I could put the two together for 35 cents. Well, that's a really good deal, so I'm going to stock up on both. The number of people in the market, also very important. If any of these things change, demand changes. So if any one of these little things changes, you can change demand. And this is the real world. And these things are in constant flux. And so to actually isolate the real demand is extremely difficult because things change every day. Changing demand, shifting the demand curve. Demand increases, the line shifts right, which we'll look at in a minute. When the taste for good increases, income increases, prices of substitute roles. We kind of talked about this on the last slide. The number of buyers increases, and demand decreases if any of these things go the other way. So we pretty much covered this on the last slide. Movements versus shifts. Change in quantity demanded. Movement along the demand curve in response to a price change. And change in demand, a shift in the demand curve to a change in one or more determinants of a demand. So change in quantity demanded is just a response to price. So change in quantity demanded response to price. Change in demand, in true demand, is one of those other factors. Change in the price of a substitute, taste. Something's not in fashion anymore. The demand for 70s style leisure suits, way down right now. It's not in style. That's a change in demand. The law of supply. The quantity of a good supplied in a given time period increases as its price increases, and vice versa. So there's a direct relationship between price and the quantity supplied. This can be a little counterintuitive at first. So the way to think of it is the quantity supplied of, let's say, hamburgers, to shift a little from cheeseburgers. The quantity supplied for hamburgers increases as its price increases. So and most people think, well, wait a minute, the more expensive they are, the fewer they'll be demanded, so there should be less supply. But remember, demand drives price, very rarely does supply. And so the way to think of it too is if the demand is increasing, then you're going to want to meet that demand with additional supply. So if you're the one making hamburgers and price is going up, you're going to want to make more hamburgers to take advantage of that rising price. Factors that set supply behavior. This is very similar to demand. Technology, factor costs, taxes and subsidies, expectations, other goods, number of sellers. So the amount of a product that's supplied is, for example, if you find out a new way to make sunglasses that instead of, say it uses materials that are much cheaper than are currently being used, and where it used to cost $10 to produce a pair of sunglasses, you can do it now for, say, $3. An improvement in technology. Now you're going to be able to supply more and drive demand, and so supply would increase. That's going to change the amount supplied. So that's just one example. Price controls. The government may impose an arbitrary maximum price or a minimum price on a market. The result is that the market cannot reach equilibrium. This is something we'll talk about a little later in the chapter, but I wanted to establish it now before we got into more supply and demand. So when the government sets a price ceiling, in other words, they say a price cannot go above a certain amount, what happens is a shortage. Perfect example was the oil situation in the late 70s, the oil crisis, the gasoline crisis. And gasoline was unintentionally rationed. Prices were skyrocketing, and President Nixon stepped in and said, you know what, I'm going to protect my people. I'm going to keep prices from going up anymore. I'm going to set a price ceiling. Gas cannot go above a certain price. And economic theory says if you set a price ceiling, there's going to be a shortage because people are going to, the demand is greater than the supply and demand curve gets out of whack, and demand is greater than the price. So the same thing would happen if you capped the price of Mercedes-Benz at $50. The demand for Mercedes would be so high that Mercedes could never meet that demand with supply. They can never make enough Mercedes. So the same thing happens with oil. You cap the price of oil too low, of gasoline too low, you can't meet the demand. For example, if gas were to suddenly be 50 cents a gallon right now, well, everybody would be storing it and going on trips, and the demand would increase dramatically. And as a result, the refineries couldn't keep up with supply. Well, that's what happened in the 70s. So there was when they set a price ceiling, we ended up with gas lines and shortages. There was a recent temptation a few years back with President Obama to once again put in price ceilings for rising gas prices. The idea was floated, but the economists jumped all over the idea on television saying, no, 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 we'll have shortages again. And the idea was quickly dropped. Price floors create a surplus. Okay, price ceilings create a shortage. Price floor creates a surplus. Good example of this is farming subsidies. Our government sets price floors for certain crops. As a result, the people growing the crops know that they can get a certain price, a minimum price for that crop. So they like that price, they grow as much as they can, and we have too much of it. And we end up with too much corn, and so we start burning corn as fuel, which we all do, 10% ethanol in all of our gas right now. Or we start selling our corn and wheat overseas, and we start selling our food because we have extra.